Wonderful. Good evening. Thank you very much to the organizers from both FMM and PKES for organizing this session and inviting me with two of my most favorite economists. So it's really a great pleasure to follow Elisa and to precede Mark at this panel. And I'm also noticing the efforts of FMM through the years trying to bring gender into the macroeconomic picture is paying off. The gender composition of the speakers is changing for the better. It's still very unequal, but I really appreciate the rise in the number of women presenting at the sessions. There are now sessions in the parallel sessions totally dedicated to the theme of gender. There are also quite a few papers across diverse sessions. So thanks to all the years of work, to all of my colleagues in achieving that. We have still a lot to do. So I will speak about what we have been doing, learning from both feminist and post-Keynesian, to be precise, post-Kaleckian economics. I have written here Synthesizing Feminist and Post-Keynesian Economics, but my reading of Post-Keynesian economics has always been Synthesizing Keynes and Marx. So you could read that as putting together feminist, Keynesian and Marxist analysis of the macroeconomy. And there is a purpose in all that. As you will see, the idea is to build a macroeconomic model to answer a policy question, really, at the end of the day, and bring all that theory to empirical terrain, saying what are the conditions, what are the policies, the tools to achieve a purple, green, red transition. A lot of what I will be talking about is based on research that we have done with my colleague Cem Oyvat at the University of Greenwich and a former PhD student, Yurdisi Fotopoulou. And some of that work has been very much driven by Elisa leading the gendering macroeconomic stream with the care economy and care work in the economy project in the past. Well, now that I think about it, since 2017. Some of these have been published, well, in the feminist economics, and I should say that's the toughest journal in terms of referee reports and revise and resubmit we have gone through, but it all paid off, and I think we are at a much better place now, hopefully, when I present the published part of that work. There's also very new work that we have just completed, really building on all these efforts of the past years about gendering macroeconomics for the ITUC. I'll share some results from that as well. So I'll start by the model, well, our post-Keynesian feminist take on macroeconomic model. I will then summarize some of the econometric findings. First, on the UK, there was a parallel project to the care work project for the SRC, and the new work that we have done for the ITUC on 8 emerging economies, and hopefully conclude with policy implications for this purple, green, red transition. I said there is a political motive behind that. I'm an activist economist, as Engelbert has mentioned in my introduction. So how can we address the multiple challenges of our time? And it is not just one challenge, all are intermingling. There's the care needs, care deficit in an aging society, there's the ecological crisis, climate change dimension, of course, inequalities in multiple dimensions of gender, class, and race. And this all is happening while we are facing new technological challenges in the age of robotization, and that brings certain questions to answer about employment prospects while addressing all these 3 multiple challenges. One policy stands out to address all these, that is public investment, and those public spending needs are increasing as these challenges deepen, and they're not in just one area, they're in multiple areas, and in particular in what feminist economists call the social infrastructure, in the care economy, and in the green economy. To address that public spending, massive mobilization of public investment challenge, we need a total new paradigm to policymaking, in particular to fiscal policy and we have coined the term needs-based approach to fiscal policy, such that public investment can address both the care and ecological deficits in our societies, while at the same time tackling multiple inequalities. And my whole aim here is to come up with a policy package out of all this macroeconomic modeling and empirical estimation exercise, to come up with tools where we can avoid fake and, in my opinion, unachievable competition between needs. We can't say climate change is the utmost priority, so now we can't talk about the care deficit, social reproduction, unpaid care burden and its distribution. No, we should and we can. So I'm trying to revitalize this very Keynesian idea of yes, we can and we should approach to policy making. And you will see the macroeconomic model that we're building and the variables we're putting in it is very much motivated with that idea. And there comes up the wealth inequality, distribution of wealth, and taxation of that very unequally distributed wealth as a very, very powerful tool to really shift towards a needs-based approach to fiscal policy. Okay, so what is the model building on? The model is synthesizing work that has been done in the realm of post-Keynesian and feminist macroeconomics. It brings together an analysis of the macroeconomic effects of different dimensions of inequalities. Obviously, functional income distribution is widely analyzed in the post-Keynesian Kaleckian tradition. Important names are already here in the audience, building on Baduri and Marglin's work. That's how I first met Eckhart. That's how I first met Engelbert, working on these questions. Nastabat, Storm, other colleagues, including myself, have done extensive work on that. There is a very rich structuralist Kaleckian feminist macro modeling by now. Of course, you have heard from Elisa and colleagues, Brownstein et al., which has been very important for me to get into gendered macro modeling to begin with. Stephanie Seguino, who was actually at this plenary in one of the earlier FMM conferences before, is another key reference here in terms of gendered macro models. Using input-output tables, there's a separate stream by asking very similar questions, coming up similar conclusions. There is a group of economists at the Levy Institute, Rania Antonopoulos and colleagues, and İpek İlkaracan and colleagues at Istanbul Technical University. Wealth concentration among these dimensions of inequalities is less researched, and there are important, of course, theoretical work here that we are building on, late Lance Taylor and colleagues, but also among us today, Daniele Tavani with Peta, Papali, who is again among us, Miriam Reim with Stefan Ederer, Zamparelli, and also from Greenwich, Botta and colleagues, have brought wealth concentration in post-Keynesian macro analysis. So we are pulling these three dimensions together. We are having both an active demand and supply side of the economy and the interaction of that. Again, in the post-Keynesian tradition, there are people, including Mark Setterfield, Eckhart Hein, and colleagues who have done that. In terms of government spending, what we bring into the picture is informed by both feminist economics and ecological macro modeling work. We are looking at separate effects of what feminists call the purple social infrastructure spending by the government, so public purple social infrastructure. We are building on the ecological macro modeling work and having an analysis of the effect of public spending in the green economy. Of course, here important names that you have been listening year after year include Yanis Dafamos and Maria Nicolaidi, who are also here. There's work again based on input-output tables by Pauline and colleagues. And again, recently, Wildauer, also from Greenwich, also speaking tomorrow, by the way, on that, has been looking at public physical infrastructure investment and how to fund that. And this is now chiming actually with work that's being done at the IMF by Battini et al. So the time is ours, I should say. There is some audience for that. Now, on the taxation side, we are, of course, building again on the work that integrated taxation of profits and wages redistribution through taxation into the Kalecki analysis. What we are trying to bring into the picture is, as I said before, wealth taxation. And last but not least, we are not stopping by analyzing the effects of policies on just aggregate output, as much as I agree with, of course, Elisa, that output means in the macroeconomy income, and higher GDP per capita is an indicator of development as well as its distribution. Of course, we are ultimately interested in the impact on jobs, on employment, and also the gender distribution of these jobs. So what does our model look like? Elisa made my job easier. It's a three-sector economy. There is a care sector in the market economy. That is what we also refer to as the social sector. That is consisting of health, social care, education, and childcare. That is producing the human capabilities, a term we borrow from Brownstein et al. Paper together with Daniele Tawani. Then there's the rest of the market economy, and the third sector is the unpaid domestic care sector. On the demand side, things look familiar from a Kaleckian model maybe. There's consumption of households, but in a feminist fashion, we look at consumption of households in the care economy as well as in the rest of the economy. There are functions of wages, but disaggregated by men's wages and women's wages, because men and women spend differently. We don't enforce any assumptions here, but what we have been able to show is that women's marginal propensity to consume in the social sector is higher than that of men. Although in aggregate, women tend to save more. I remember Stephanie years ago here at the FMM conference explaining that by women facing more uncertainty and volatility in their income, but their caring responsibilities, since they do the majority of the unpaid care work at home as well, is also tilting their spending in the market economy more towards the social sector. It's something we find again. There is no assumption. It all comes from data speaking for you, but it's quite consistent with what is observed in both microdata and in feminist theory. Of course, consumption is also a function of profit income, and we do find, again, evidence that, of course, marginal propensity to consume out of profit income is the lowest out of these three income categories. And there is also consumption out of wealth. There is a class analysis of wealth distribution. There is a top 1% versus bottom 99%. This is something imposed by data on us. You could read about that as the wealth of the working class versus the capitalists, but actually the data is simpler than that, top 1% versus the rest. Investment is a function of the profit share after tax. Of course, demand effects matter. It's a function of the output. We allow for wealth effects, again, distributed as the wealth of 1% versus 99%. Investment, well, as well as consumption, is also a function of government spending, because some government spending, for example, the provision of public transport, might reduce some types of private consumption, say in private transport vehicles. In the case of private investment, some public investment might make other types of private investment redundant, or it might improve the infrastructure and make it easier. So beyond the demand effects, you may have positive or negative effects of government spending. Public debt to GDP ratio is also a part of the investment function, because a rise in public spending, if it does lead to a rise in public debt to GDP ratio, and if that leads to a rise in interest rates, could have potentially a negative effect on investment, depending on, of course, the elasticity of investment to interest rate. Exports and imports are functions of relative prices. Exports respond to world GDP, and exchange rates. Imports would respond to countries' own GDP. For simplification, we say marginal propensity to import is negligible in the social sector. It's more coming from the rest of the economy. We look at three types of government spending. So care spending of the government in the social sector, that is. Then we look at government's investment in the green economy, or government's actually current and capital spending in the green economy. That includes investing in renewable energy. We define that as solar, wind, hydro, and geothermal, as well as energy efficiency. That includes insulation, industry, and grids, and public transport, excluding air transport. That's the sector we labeled as REPT, renewable energy, energy efficiency, public transport, when it pops up later in the slides. That's something we have literally done this year with GEM for the ITUC, going into the granular detail of public spending in the green economy. Then there can be other types of public capital spending, that is other gross fixed capital formation. That could be in social housing or building the schools that would provide the physical infrastructure to the social infrastructure, because the care spending or education spending is simply the wages of nursery teachers, nurses, or care workers. But you need also the schools and hospitals. That's all in the other infrastructure spending. Taxes, of course, are collected to finance that spending. It can be collected on wage income, profit income, wealth, or consumption. Debt to GDP ratio hence will evolve endogenously with changes in government spending, taxes, tax revenues and tax rights, and aggregate effects on aggregate output. Unpaid care in the domestic sector is, of course, determined by the needs. That's exogenous demographic structure of the economy. And it does decline if there is public provision of care. At least some types of unpaid care could potentially decline. And I know we have long discussions with Nancy Fulbright that decline doesn't apply to all kinds of care, or some other types of care may even go up if more supervisory care is being provided by the public sector. Similarly, obviously, if households are capable of spending in the social sector, in the private sector, that would have implications for unpaid domestic care as well. On the supply side, we look at productivity, technological change, as endogenously evolving in the medium run, not in the short run, in the rest of the economy. That is, in the non-care sector, in the non-care market sector, as a function of, positive function of wages, output of the sector itself, public spending in both the care and physical infrastructure, private investment of the sector itself, household spending in the care economy, because it also creates capabilities, and unpaid care, again, it creates human capabilities. Labor force participation of men and women separately depend on their wages, the provision or availability of social infrastructure positively, and it will negatively depend on the need for unpaid care. So unpaid care needs would be a supply constraint from labor force supply perspective. In the model, employment of men and women are determined endogenously. They change with changes in output and productivity. They're subject to occupational segregation in the rest of the economy and the care economy separately, and we let that change endogenously in the new piece of work we're working on. It's the same, repeated? Okay. Then there is a distribution and price setting block of the model. Prices are set as a markup on unit labor costs and other input costs. In the medium run, obviously, changes in wages that lead to inflation will, however, also trigger a change in labor productivity, and then that will affect unit labor costs, which in turn will moderate or offset at least part of the wage effect, short-term wage effect on prices. Wages are determined by labor market bargaining. It's a function of the employment as a ratio to labor force of men and women separately, and men and women's wage bargaining also respond to each other's wages. That's something we endogenized in the new piece of work. It was treated as exogenous in the earlier generations of this model. Any change in wage rates or gender gaps or taxes will affect both functional income distribution and wealth distribution. Private net wealth is accumulated, that's net wealth, endogenously in the model with changes in wages, profits, and wealth concentration or inequality is defined as the share of the top 1% in total wealth. I'm going to skip this analysis of how a change in public spending in the care economy could affect the macroeconomy in the short run and in the long run in terms of effects on the labor productivity, because I have run out of time. I will also not be able to go into the details of how we then operationalize that empirically, but we have a single equation estimation model for the paper that was published in Feminist Economics early this year for the UK. We estimated demand side of the model as well as wealth accumulation using instrumental variables, thanks to feminist economics referees, pushing us to find the really good instruments, because if you work with gender data, actually there are a lot better instruments than what you struggle to find when you work with aggregate macro models, I learned in this exercise. We do have a panel data estimation to find the productivity effects of all these wages and government social infrastructure spending versus other variables. And for the new version of the model, where a lot of things are endogenized, wage bargaining and occupational segregation, labor supply, while we are using a simple VAR system approach, that helps us to have a model where we claim there is endogeneity, because we don't have to analytically solve that. Now, what do we find in terms of the effects of social infrastructure investment? In the short run, you would have positive effects on consumption. That's coming from the UK analysis. It is a very strong effect, because we are talking about a very labor-intensive sector. And it's not just the composition, the level of consumption, but also the composition of consumption that is changing here, because that's a sector with a very high women share in total employment. So more income in the hands of women is also meaning more household consumption in things that will enhance social capabilities and productivity. Investment is, of course, booming with social infrastructure investment. There are very negligibly small negative effects coming from a potential public debt to GDP increase, but that effect is small. In the medium run, there are further positive effects that are coming, because social infrastructure is a very strong driver of productivity in the rest of the economy. So investment and net exports are getting a medium run, second round boost as well. Employment of women and men both are increasing, both in the short and the long run, medium run. This is despite the fact that we have very strong productivity effects of social infrastructure spending, but they are so, output stimulus is so strong that despite increasing productivity, in the medium run, employment increases as well. The composition of employment changes in favor of women, although there are a lot of jobs created for men as well. Then we have looked at the effects that could come from wage stimulus in the rest of the economy, as well as in the social sector or care economy. What we find for the UK at least, this doesn't have to be like that for all economies, but wage stimulus as well as closing the gender gaps, even when men's wages don't change, just increasing women's wages, or doing both, upward convergence, meaning increasing both men's and women's wages, though in a fashion that will close gender gaps, are all stimulating the economy. The stimulus is stronger when that wage increases in the social sector, because that doesn't have the same profit squeeze effects. Again, of course, consumption increases, private investment rallies, even when the private or rest of the economy wages go up. Despite the profit share decline, there is one more magical thing happening with pay rise or gender gap closure. Wealth concentration decreases, and mind you, that's a very key stimulus to private investment, again, for the case of the UK. Now, here is the one thing I learned that was interesting. If you just rely on wage stimulus, reading what we have been doing wrong in a way, because we never say just wage stimulus will be enough, in the medium run you run into a problem, because wage stimulus does lead to positive output effects, but that effect is small. Productivity effect, however, of wage stimulus is quite substantial. So in the medium run, if you rely on wage increases, employment will decline. Hence, if you want full employment as the government, you have to put your money where your mouth is. Hence, you need to complement wage policies with fiscal policy, particularly in the medium run. I have said things about the wealth taxation, and I want to go into a little bit more into detail because it's a core element of having a good list of needs for fiscal spending. Then the question, how are we going to fund it? Well, I do believe we can use all the tools in our toolkit. Eventually, we need, if you're not the US, probably, or if you're a country like the UK, you need to show that you will be able to fund your spending beyond just borrowing. So here comes wealth taxation. If you do that, obviously wealth concentration decreases. This seems to be, in Britain in particular, having a downward cap on financialization and market concentration, which is providing a very strong stimulus to private investment, and thereby the impact of anything that will decrease wealth inequality has a very strong positive effect on output, employment of men and women naturally, but also the budget balance. Hence, it is a key tool if you want to push for a massive public investment mobilization for a needs-based fiscal policy. So then we mix all these policies together, a social purple and physical green infrastructure investment matched by progressive income and wealth taxation, and also labor market policies in the rest of the economy for upward convergence in wages. So for the UK, what we find again is very strong output effect, strong employment effect, and public finance is improving with about 10 percentage point decline in public debt to GDP ratio. For the emerging economies, similar results are confirmed, very strong multiplier effects of public investment in the green and care economy on GDP, a very strong productivity effect, and public investment is partly self-financing, but again, it's of course not totally self-financing. And then we did a policy mix addressing some of the required investment needs coming from ecological macroeconomics and a care economy project for the ILO. What we found was if we live up to those required investments, we are able to create jobs in the emerging economies, in investing in the care and green economy, where we hit employment rates that are about 70% in several countries, and even in the countries where we started a very low rate, we are still able to reach towards 60% in India or Turkey. Gender employment gaps, though, still persist, so you need to do more. Okay, I'm going to conclude. This is my -1 minute Engelbert bonus. A purple, green, red New Deal, of course, has public investment in its core. It's partly self-financing, but you need progressive taxation of not just income, but also wealth. You need to tap into other tools, of course, national investment banks, monetary policy, and borrowing. Fiscal policy effects are strong even if you are a small emerging economy and even if you go alone. But of course they will be stronger if they are coordinated across countries, and they are stronger if they are coordinated with labor market policies. Green and care economy jobs are a key element of transitioning to a zero carbon economy and redeployment from fossil fuel-based sectors. And elsewhere we also write that purple and green are complementary. because, well, they are low carbon intensive and they are labor intensive. Hence, redefine also your green policies. Investing in the care economy is and should be part of green transition policies. These alone won't be enough. So what we would need, of course, more systematic hiring and training policies, what Diane Alson refers to as recognize, reduce, redistribute, unpaid care, and shorter working hours in that spirit to also achieve a gender equal caring and green transition. Thank you for your generosity as the chair, and thanks for your attention.